You might know Simone and Malcolm Collins as the Pronatalist Couple. They have been all over people's screens in the past couple of years talking about pronatalism, and they recently made a video on their YouTube channel Basecamp where they go over antinatalism in detail, and they really spread a lot of misinformation, have a lot of misconceptions, and honestly I think they've kind of descended into just throwing red meat to their base. So in this video I wanted to go over their video. I'm not going to go over every single point because it was a really long video, and I also thought there were tangents that we just don't need to address. So I'm going to be addressing a select few points from the video. If you want to watch the whole thing, I've linked it in the description below. But without further ado, let's get into it.
Hello, Simone. I'm excited to be here with you today. Today, we are going to go back to a topic that needs to be revisited because of the number of terrorist attacks that have been tied to it recently and its relevance to us as people who are generally seen as running the pronatalist movement, or at least the pro-tech faction of the pronatalist movement. And this is the subject of antinatalism.
So very quickly, the majority of their video is about antinatalism as a set of ideas, but they start by mentioning the recent terrorist attack in Palm Springs. Now, this was a horrific and immoral act, which I'm not going to relitigate here, but if you want to see my thoughts on it, I did a video responding to the incident that's linked in the description. They then go on to mention a couple of other acts of terrorism and linking it to Efilism, but they also seem to, and they do this constantly throughout the video, conflate Efilism and antinatalism, or they say that Efilism is downstream of antinatalism. Now, I know this is an area of active disagreement amongst antinatalists themselves. I'm personally of the opinion that Efilism and antinatalism are conceptually very distinct, and I don't think one is downstream from the other. If you want to know more about my take on Efilism and if it relates at all to antinatalism, then I've done a whole video on that, again linked in the description. And just to show one example where they explicitly conflate Efilism and antinatalism, check out this next clip.
This is actually something that came up in the manifesto of the most recent terrorist. He said antinatalism isn't nihilism. And I think people really misunderstand it. They think that antinatalists are just deeply depressed people who think that nothing matters in the world. He says, no, that's not true. Antinatalists believe very vehemently in one thing, which is that suffering is bad and we need to end it. And if you are a more extreme antinatalist like him, you are essentially on a holy war to end suffering by ending sentience. Like, you have an imperative to end life, and you're willing to do that.
That can suffer. If suffer is the core evil in the universe, and you need to end the things that can suffer.
So we can see here that they pretty much word for word describe Efilism, but attribute it to the label of antinatalism. Antinatalism isn't about ending suffering. That is a definition of antinatalism that would be so far removed from how the vast majority of people use it and the view that it's been historically attached to. What antinatalism actually is the view that it's morally wrong to create sentient beings, or some people specifically say human beings. But both the sentiocentric and anthropocentric versions of antinatalism are very different from Efilism. Now, someone might be an antinatalist as part of a wider view that they have that suffering should be ended, but that doesn't mean that antinatalism is tied to that implication. Just like most people view murder as being wrong, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they want to launch a campaign to end all of suffering. These are two separate questions. You might have a person who does want to go on a campaign to end all of suffering, and being against murder might be part of that, but we need to appreciate that these are two conceptually distinct things. And again, if you want to look into this more, then I've done a video on mistakes antinatalists make about antinatalism, but it also seems that non-antinatalists also make it. Again, that's linked in the description.
One of the new arguments that I don't know why I didn't think of this when we were writing our book is what antinatalists will tell you, because what you might be thinking is, wait, they want to end suffering. Do they not think that they are doing harm to individuals when they, in their lives, and they're like, oh, well, what we would do is not in the lives of living individuals, just prevent the lives of individuals who are gonna come into being in the future, right? Through sterilization or through not having kids. And so they're like, you can't harm somebody who hasn't been born yet, which for me, I just find to be on its face a ludicrous idea. Like, very obviously you can. This isn't the new argument, but if you go back in time and you sterilize my wife, you have done harm to my children. You are responsible for the differential impacts on the timeline that every one of your choices make, whether or not those people have been born yet or not. Trying to weasel your way out of that is the most morally, like honestly, like, it feels like a supervillain from a show where he's like, I've done nothing wrong. I merely went back in time and prevented the births of people who, it's like, well, you prevented, he's like, but they didn't exist when I prevented them from existing. And it's like, well, they would have existed without your action. Like, clearly you're responsible for that.
So there's a few things to say here. So the first is that Malcolm seems to be saying that antinatalists are trying to escape from responsibility for their actions. I don't think that's what antinatalists are trying to do at all. Obviously, antinatalists will recognize that if you act in certain ways, it's going to result in a being created, and if you act in other ways, it's going to result in a being not being created, and we are responsible for our actions and the consequences of actions to some extent. The point of contention, though, is whether the consequences of our actions that we are responsible for are bad, i.e., is it a bad thing to avoid a sentient being coming into existence? In my view, someone who never exists cannot be harmed, in any meaningful sense of the word anyway. They don't exist to be deprived of any life, of any agency, of anything that they would have experienced were they to have come into existence. And the hypothetical that Malcolm is presenting to try and make his point is super misleading for two main reasons. The first is that if someone forced sterilized Simone, his wife, they would have obviously harmed Simone. So that's the first thing to get out of the way. Onto the potential children, how could they have been harmed? They haven't come into existence. If you remove the bit of his thought experiment about forced sterilization, because I think that is something that we view as wrong and is going to color the rest of the considerations, and forced sterilization isn't something that's advocated for by antinatalism inherently. If you remove that part, then it's simply just Simone voluntarily not having children. So what if we change the hypothetical to that? Rather than someone going back in time, doing a double backflip, and then forced sterilizing his wife Simone, why don't we just go with the hypothetical of Simone voluntarily chooses not to procreate? Would she then be harming the children that never exist, but that she could have created? In my view, no, obviously not. These children never came into existence, and there's no meaningful way that they can be harmed by that. And if it were the case that they were harmed by that, then all of us around the world are harming non-existent beings by not bringing them into existence, and not bringing as many as we can into existence that we can cater for. The reason this hypothetical has emotional appeal is because, one, of the forced sterilization point, but also that Malcolm is using the example of kids that already exist. So when people consider this hypothetical based around his children that already exist, they're really going to be thinking of those kids' lives ending, because we see those lives and then we look at the counterfactual where they don't exist, and it's so easy for our mind to intuitively think that that life has ended rather than never come into existence, because we've already seen that life in existence. If we were to change the hypothetical so that Malcolm's children who already exist aren't involved, and he was to present it to the public and say, we're just not going to have any more kids, are we harming them? I think people's intuitions about this hypothetical would be very different from the ones Malcolm is assuming for the one he presented. And if you want to look a bit more into people's general ways of thinking about these hypotheticals where beings never come into existence, and why actually a lot of people think about it in a faulty way, then I've done a video on this called I'm Glad to Be Born Debunked, and I've linked it in the description. If you watch that video, you'll see why what Malcolm is presenting here is faulty.
How is it that you believe that your existence is at such a privileged level compared to the people who haven't been born yet? How could you even come to be that narcissistic? And this is the thing, right? Fundamentally, is you can always choose to not exist. They can't choose to manifest themselves into existence. You are never doing harm by bringing a life into the world, because that life can always remove itself. You are always doing harm by not bringing a life into the world, because that life can't choose to. This is like the basic. This isn't like a new argument. This is something that anyone who has applied even the basic logic to this should be able to see. And they're like, oh no, but ending myself is so hard. And it's like, no. It's that you don't want to. You are a fundamentally vile and selfish person.
So I think it's pretty clear why we should value the lives of those who already exist, or those who will exist independent of our actions, over those that we have the choice as to whether we should create or not. Just to give one example to help show why this is the case, let's consider this example. Say you have 5 bottles of water at your disposal, and you have 5 people in front of you that are extremely thirsty. Should we prioritize giving those 5 bottles of water to those people, people? Or should we prioritize creating 5 additional people and giving the water to them? Or should we be indifferent as to which option we go for? By creating those new people, you have one, created new deprivation and need in them, but you've also created a situation where you're going to be diverting resources away from people who are already in need of those resources and are going to suffer as a result of not getting them. The need of those who already exist is more important than those who you could create and will have need as a result. There is no reason to create that new need. People who exist have tangible needs, and there's an immediacy to trying to relieve their deprivation and suffering. Non-existent beings that will never exist don't have either of those things, and so in no way should we value their lives on a footing with existing lives or lives that will come into existence independent of our actions, because we do have to recognize that future beings will come into existence that we don't play a part in creating. And given that they will exist, it is important to cater for their needs even though their needs don't exist yet, because we know they will exist. But if we have a choice as to whether to create the new needs or not, we shouldn't create them, especially when there's currently existing people who need the resources that we have at our disposal. And this whole thing that Malcolm's going on about killing yourself, it just seems like he's stooped to such a low, callous and cruel level here. So he says you're never doing harm by creating someone. I mean, that's insane, because there are people that have absolutely miserable lives, but he's saying you can't do that because they always have the option of killing themselves. If you're putting someone into a situation where the only way they can get out of it is by killing themselves, usually in the world we're in now, that includes mutilating themselves, that seems completely bankrupt to me. And they're in a situation where, because of billions of years of evolution, they've got a life drive and a fear of death burnt into their psyche that's going to make them irrationally persist through extreme suffering that they have no real prospect of getting over. One of those things is existence bias, which I recently did a video on, more specifically how it influences our procreative decisions, but again, I'll link that in the description. But to then tell someone who's been created, is in a situation that is awful because they've gotten to the point where they're considering ending their life, and then they've got all these cognitive biases and fears burnt into their psyche that is making them persist through the suffering and actually not choosing to end their life when it would be rational to, because there are specific cases where it would be rational to end one's life. Not all cases, but some specific cases. You then call that person vile and selfish. How abusive and manipulative is that? And such a terrible way to talk to someone who is clearly in a vulnerable position. To be honest, I don't really have anything more to say on this. You kind of saw the clip, you know where he's coming from, so we'll just leave it at that.
Euthanasia should be a lot easier, and I 1000% agree. Like, yes.
No, of course you agree with that, but that's neither here nor there. Even where euthanasia is not legal, it is really not that hard to unalive yourself. The
Everything's harder when you're depressed. I mean, you know.
I guess, but it's to contrast the difficulty of that with manifesting your existence when somebody decided to sterilize your parents is astronomical.
So very quickly, I just put this clip in because I wanted to show that Simone is actually more reasonable than Malcolm. She does try to include nuance and pushback, and I've seen this across their videos. She is the more reasonable of the two. Malcolm at this point has just become completely unhinged, but Simone I think can be very reasonable. And Malcolm then goes on to compare the difficulty of ending one's life, which can be very difficult, especially when you don't have access to euthanasia or assisted dying, like Simone says. But Malcolm compares that difficulty to the difficulty of a non-existent being creating themselves, which is obviously impossible, so it is a lot more difficult. But I'm not entirely sure what point he is making here. He just seems to be digging himself deeper into the hole of victim-blaming suicidal people.
They'll make arguments like, well, people who haven't been born yet don't exist yet. How can you say that somebody who doesn't exist yet's life has value? And it's like, bro, they only don't exist yet from your arbitrary position on the timeline. How arrogant do you have to be to believe that your arbitrary position on the timeline is the moral nexus of all reality? This is just a trick of how humans perceive time. Like, clearly those future events are going to happen, and you are responsible for them, and you are responsible for the differential effects you have on the timeline. Saying that all humans within X part of a timeline's lives have literally zero value, and your life is exponentially superior to theirs in terms of its value, is the same as me saying everyone who lives in a specific geographic region, like Africa or something's life has no value, because they're in a different point within the spatial representation of our reality. It's a horrifying thing to do. It's almost as if they're trying to argue that future events are not real, which is, to me, just bizarre that anybody could bring themselves to believe that. But it is this level of dehumanization of people who are in a different location on the timeline than them.
So I might just be being thick here, but I don't entirely understand the point that Malcolm is making. Whether you view time in this way doesn't seem to be super relevant to me on the question of procreative ethics. Even if you see time in this way and you act in such a way where someone who would have come into existence doesn't come into existence, they simply never exist. Again, it isn't clear why that is a bad thing for them. That's the key question here. Why is it bad to avoid someone coming into existence? And it's nothing like arbitrarily discriminating against someone because of the geography that they live in. Those people exist and can be harmed in tangible ways. And so the interest they have in avoiding harm should be equally considered against other people's interests, not discriminated against based on biology. Now, Malcolm would say, well, why are you discriminating against them based on time? But there's a confusion here because it's not a discrimination based on time, it's a discrimination based on the fact that they don't exist and never have to exist, and so we can choose not to create them. Now, obviously time is a relevant factor because they're not in existence at the time that we're deciding whether to create them, but the morally relevant factor is that we can choose that they never exist, not time necessarily.
When you think of how people relate to identity, very few people outside of the urban monoculture have a primary identity which is individual based. So by this, what I mean is I would ask, have you done harm to a Native American tribe if you sterilize all of their members? And your average person or average member of that tribe would be like, you have literally committed genocide against us. You have done the most harm anyone could conceivably commit against our people.
Well, and there have been historical instances of certain types of people being sterilized, and that is I'm pretty universally condemned. I don't know if anyone who's like that. But to an antinatalist,
you have done that tribe a favor.
So now Malcolm is just ignorantly spouting off stuff about antinatalism, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. If you have a group of people, a tribe, and you force sterilize them, obviously you've done harm to those people. You violated their autonomy. You presumably had to go and round them up, catch them, strap them down, drug them, perform an unelected surgery on them, itself that comes with health risks. All of these things are forms of harm that you've imposed on these people. Sure, if a group is sterile, they don't create new beings, and it's not bad for those new beings that they never come into existence. But you've still done harm to the people in the tribe by force sterilizing them. Sure, avoiding beings from coming into existence is a good thing on an antinatalist view, but it shouldn't be pursued by any means. And the means Malcolm is laying out is an unethical one and has done harm to that tribe. Antinatalism simply says that it's morally wrong to create sentient beings. It does not prescribe force sterilizing groups of people. This is like saying, well, anti-poverty activists want to get rid of poverty. To everyone else, it's unacceptable to execute poor people, but anti-poverty activists would say that you're doing them a favor by executing them because you're getting rid of their poverty. But this is just a myopic way of focusing on one outcome someone might think is good and ignoring any other values that they might have. Yes, someone might be an antinatalist, someone might be an anti-poverty activist, but that doesn't mean they want to pursue that thing myopically via any means, including unethical ones. Someone might hold those views and then also hold other views like, not executing people or not forced sterilizing people. Malcolm was just being completely ignorant in this clip.
And this is because to an antinatalist, the only unit at which humans exist is at the level of the individual, not at any other level, not at the level of the family, not at the level of the civilization or the society, or at the level of which, the thing that you are continuing. Yet to most other humans that exist, they don't exist at the level of the individual. The Native American might say, well, first and foremost, I'm a member of my tribe, right? Or a lot of right-wingers will say, first and foremost, I'm a member of Western civilization, right? And I see my goal as building on that civilization, living for something that I see as greater than myself. And the antinatalist will say, well, wait, what? They'll be like, wait, you live for something other than yourself. Explain that to me. And it's like, most humans live for things other than themselves. It's clearly how we're programmed to live.
Again, this is just Malcolm making wild claims. Of course, you might find individual antinatalists who myopically focus on themselves as individuals and don't appreciate how they can connect to wider groups, and they think that everything should be to serve them. But to paint all antinatalists with this brush is just ignorant, especially given the fact that there are many people like that and most of them aren't antinatalists. By and large, antinatalists are just regular members of society. We have families that we are a part of. We have social groups. We're part of sports clubs. We are part of and appreciate cultures, nations, and international communities. There are plenty of things antinatalists live for other than themselves. They even say in this video that many antinatalists are vegan. Many antinatalists do animal rights activism. That's the definition of doing things not for yourself. This was just such an ignorant clip from Malcolm. He's just completely gone off on one, and he's just trying to demonize antinatalists at this point, throwing red meat to his base, not caring at all for reality.
And I note here, one argument that you always get from antinatalists is, oh, well, you can't meaningfully consent for someone bringing you into existence. And again, this to me is such a vile thing to say, because that person also can't consent to not exist. And because the vast majority, and you can say, well, I've done nothing wrong if they didn't exist yet. Why? What? Like, there is no logical reason for that argument. This is one of these arguments that only works if you're just completely cooked in like a philosopher sphere and you're not thinking about the real world at all. You have clearly done harm if you prevent somebody from existing. Like, clearly. I do not understand, and this is obviously a big, objection we have to like Catholics who think that like life begins at conception and stuff like that, and we think they're murdering babies by not using IVF, right? Like, we're like, clearly, if you went back in time and sterilized someone, you are responsible for every differential thing within that timeline.
So I've already covered much of what Malcolm is saying. I'm not going to relitigate everything here again. But Malcolm just really needs to demonstrate why someone who never comes into existence is harmed in any tangible way. He keeps using this imagery of going back in time and force sterilizing someone. And I've already said why that's a dishonest way of framing things. It poisons the well with the forced sterilization, and it encourages people thinking faultily about counterfactuals where someone never exists, because you're using the example of someone who already exists. A better example would be to use the example of someone who just voluntarily doesn't procreate, just chooses not to have kids. Why would that be wrong for the child they could have created? Are we collectively as a species engaging in a Holocaust-like action because we're not bringing beings into existence as much as we could do? Most people have 2 or 3 or 1 child or no children. Are they failing morally by not bringing as many beings into existence as they could cater for? He also mentions the consent argument. The reason that someone being brought into existence and not being able to consent to it is problematic, and why someone who never exists not being able to consent to never existing isn't problematic, is because one imposes serious harm on someone and the other one doesn't. And just so people don't get taken in by Malcolm's claim that you're harming people by never creating them, really think about the actual harms that someone will experience once they come into existence, and notice how none of those things would happen to someone who never exists. You can check that out in my video Why Your Life is Worse Than You Think, which is linked in the description. But in short, the harms that Malcolm perceives happening to someone who never exists don't happen to that person because they don't exist. They only exist in the mind of Malcolm.
There is a version of antinatalism that just is accompanied by winning people over through logical argument to your view, and then all of you deciding.
It would never work. I don't believe, like, there's people who say that they believe this, right? There are a lot of people, but it's not logically coherent because it would obviously never work.
What do you mean? Because in the end, just those who actually love to live and care about living will be left.
Yes, even at a genetic level, it would eventually fail because humans would adopt to this philosophy and no longer feel the suffering that they are so afraid of feeling. Or they become psychologically resistant in some other way because evolution exists and evolution can resist memes. Like, it's a completely incoherent and fantastical philosophy that people say they believe because they don't want to be called out for what their philosophy always actually leads to, which is Efilism. Like, intellectually, nobody really believes that they can convince all of human civilization of this if they have put thought into the fact that it really requires you to have a perception of reality that is totally different than the vast majority of living humans.
So there are a few things to say here. First, very quickly, just again on this Efilism antinatalism thing, to really go into it, check out my video on Efilism. I'm not going to go into all the details here. They keep on linking the two, and in my video I explain why I think that's unfounded. The other thing Malcolm does is dismiss antinatalist motivations for trying to change people's minds. He says that this isn't going to work, you're not going to convince everyone to not have kids, and you're not going to bring about some ultimate solution. But what if an antinatalist antinatalist isn't aiming at an ultimate solution. Something doesn't have to provide an ultimate solution to still be valid. It is possible that someone just wants to have a good impact as an individual and they're not doing it in reference to some utopian goal. We can convince at least some people not to procreate, as antinatalists have, and you can do other things to avoid sentient beings from coming into existence, like donating to charities or changing your eating habits. But Malcolm is fixed on this notion that anything you propose has to include an ultimate solution to suffering and convincing all of humanity not to procreate. What if you just don't have that goal? Why does that need to be the benchmark? It would be perfectly valid for someone to, as an individual, want to bring down the murder rate as much as they can, but knowing that they're never going to stop humans murdering completely. You can have your own impact in your own way and not have to meet the benchmark of providing a perfect solution to everything.
But to go further, risk and uncertainty arguments. They'll say something like, since we cannot predict what quality of life someone will have, some lives involve extreme suffering, it may be wrong to take that gamble on their behalf. What's really psychotic about this, they're like, okay, some lives have extreme suffering, but it's like, yeah, but those people continue to exist, right? Like they could choose to stop their existence. No, not in every single instance, but in most instances, these people are choosing their continued existence, which I think fundamentally undermines everything the antinatalist believes, because they're basically saying, look at this person who is undergoing all this suffering. And that individual who's undergoing all this suffering is saying, yeah, but life is still worth it for me, despite my wife being
like, I'm right here and I don't want to die.
I'm right here. And they're like, well, you don't get to make that decision. Why don't they, the individual who's experiencing all this, get to make that decision? Why is this your decision to make? Right? Like that's so psychotic. And why can't you look at the individual who is experiencing all this suffering and still sees purpose in life and say, hey, why are all of them seeing that I don't see?
First of all, it is someone's decision to make for themselves whether they think it's rational to end their life or not. Obviously, unless there are cases where someone's incapacitated and their family or a professional has to act in their own best interests. But by and large, yes, it should be someone's own decision to make for themselves. Antinatalism doesn't say anything about whether someone should continue to exist once they're here. It's neutral on that matter. Malcolm also talks about how some people who suffer unspeakably still choose to continue to exist. And there are a few things to say on this. The first thing is that there's a difference between choosing for yourself to continue to exist and go through that suffering and imposing that suffering on someone else by creating them. Voluntary suffering that one chooses for oneself and imposing suffering on someone else is very different. Second thing is, once we exist, we have all sorts of cognitive biases that are playing on our decision-making process. And this complicates the picture of existence. I've spoken about this in a range of videos, and my most recent one was on existence bias. There are also interests that we have, like continuing to exist, and any harm that we can reasonably expect to undergo in the future needs to be weighed up against these interests, and if it's significant enough, it can defeat those interests, and then it would be rational to end one's life. But we are not rational beings, and like I said, the cognitive biases we suffer from can make us do things that aren't actually in our interest, and that complicates the picture of existence. This is something we need to take into account when we're appealing to people who choose to go through significant suffering and try to use it to justify imposing suffering on new people.
Because I've noticed most of these people are like middle upper class people. This is not a phenomenon that is concentrated in like lower classes or like in the starving places in Africa or in developing countries. This is a philosophy that really only appeals to people who have lived with so much overwhelming privilege that they're like, what? I have to suffer in life? I don't want to do that. Like, what? Suffering?
Again, this is just Malcolm speaking out both sides of his mouth. There are many antinatalists from all sorts of areas of the world, from different socio-economic backgrounds, religions, and everything you can think of. In fact, many antinatalists are antinatalists because of the significant suffering they've gone through. If you want to see just a small selection of the variety of antinatalists that are out there, you can check out my series Antinatalism Around the World. I speak to antinatalists in different countries who are in different situations, and yeah, antinatalists aren't just all one group of people. Next, Malcolm goes on to read sections of a book that him and Simone have published. So let's listen to that next.
The first position antinatalists instinctively take is that the average human experiences more negative than positive emotions in their lifetime, or at least that negative emotions are felt more acutely than positive ones and therefore outweigh them. As such, antinatalists conclude it would be better if one never existed in the first place. The problem with this argument is that the vast majority of people do not, in fact, wish that they were never born. Heck, we neither value happiness nor love, and we certainly don't seek them out, and yet our lives are overflowing with them. Our biology naturally drowns us in positive emotions when we are efficaciously working for the betterment of our species with people we respect and who respect us in turn. To address the average person's hesitations, antinatalists typically make one of 5 arguments. Argument 1, humans don't realize how bad their lives are. Antinatalists posit that people are incapable of judging whether they like their own lives, typically citing cognitive bias to do so. While they are right that humans remember positive events more accurately than negative ones, they are incorrect in assuming that this bias is strong enough to convince a person with a terrible life that their life is actually good.
So I'm not going to get into the empirics of the biases that antinatalists and Malcolm talk about, because I don't think that would be the most fruitful way of going forward with this specific line of reasoning. What I will say is, once you're here, apart from when your biases lead you to impose harm on others, it's probably good that you suffer from them at least sometimes. If they do actually improve your experience of life and lead you to have more positive experiences, then that's probably a good thing. It's not like I want people to have shit lives. I recognize that we're here and it's a predicament that we're here, but you should try and make the best of it now you're here. I want people to be aware of their biases, but try and have the best life they can now that they are in existence. They also make this overarching point that people say that they're glad to be born regardless. And again, if someone has such a life that they are glad to have been born, then I'm happy for them. I don't want them to have a bad life. The question is whether this is a justification for creating new people, and I don't think it is. I've already gone over why in other videos, so I'm not going to lay it out here. I will link those videos in the description, and I'm going to include a clip from one of them now. Many natalists like to point out that most people are glad to have been born, as I think they try to use this as a justification for assuming consent in the person they want to create, or at least lessening the perceived harm that is going to be imposed on them. But there is one difficulty with the doctrine of future consent, which is serious enough to refute it altogether. This is the possibility of manipulating the recipient of the paternalistic intervention in a manner that automatically leads to consent and gratitude later. Given a simple interpretation of the doctrine, it would be permissible for the public authorities to imprison people and turn them into religious or political fanatics, provided only that the manipulative program in question includes a section which teaches the brainwashed people themselves to appreciate the treatment when it is over. And it seems, at least to me, that similar critiques could be made of the retrospective consent that is given by people under the duress of natalist Stockholm syndrome. And that's not to say that anyone has intentionally manipulated our psychology, but that we've been conditioned by the environment and the people that we're surrounded by and interact with.
Argument 2, positive emotions don't matter, negative emotions do. More convincingly, antinatalists will argue the positive emotions we think we feel do not actually matter or impart meanings to our lives. The argument usually goes something like this. Sisyphus was cursed to roll a ball up a hill forever, only to have it roll back down after making it to the top. Most people would see this as a meaningless existence. Suppose somebody reprogrammed Sisyphus's brain to enjoy the process and get a sense of deep fulfillment from rolling the ball up the hill. If you engaged him and tried to get him to stop, he wouldn't, telling you how wonderful ball rolling was for him. Does his life have value now? The average person's intuition holds that his existence remains meaningless. Antinatalists proceed to extend this argument to other scenarios. Suppose a person gained pleasure and fulfillment from eating feces. Would life spent consuming fecal matter have value? The gist of the argument is that if stupid things can make you happy or give you a feeling of fulfillment, then you should not derive meaning from positive emotions. And if positive emotional states can have no value, then what's the point of existing? David Benatar believes this point so strongly that he argues he would be ambivalent between non-existent and the most perfect life conceivable.
So I can't speak for every antinatalist, obviously, and that goes for the whole of this video, but I don't think antinatalists are saying that positive experience don't matter at all. Once you're here, obviously it's better to have more of the positives than the negatives. What's being said is that positive experiences don't count as a reason to create someone, because they are, like Sisyphus, just trying to push a boulder up a hill. Positive experiences are simply trying to attend to a deprivation that has been instilled in the person when creating them. Once you have the deprivation and you exist, obviously we should try and service that and satiate it with positive experience, but it's not worth creating it in the first place. The other thing Malcolm says about meaning, again, the same principle applies. Once we're here, we are meaning seekers, and it would be good to try and get meaning, even if that is from a cosmically meaningless perspective, i.e. there's no grand meaning or purpose to the universe, but once we exist as individuals, we can subjectively create meaning, and that would be a good thing because we subjectively crave meaning. But that doesn't mean we should create new meaning seekers.
Antinatalists tie their tongues in knots, trying to argue that per their worldview, it would not be immoral to push a button that painlessly and simultaneously extinguished the life of every single person. We lose a lot of respect for philosophy that is either unwilling to or unable to publicly swallow the socially unpopular implications of their moral positions. So here's what I'm saying is, if you actually accept, and I'm talking about the non-Efilis antinatalists here, if you actually accept the fundamental philosophy of negative utilitarianism or antinatalism, you should believe the very obviously immoral thing that it is immoral to push a button that kills all humans painlessly. And yet they know that they can't accept this because it makes their entire movement look like crazy people to everyone else. And so they will try to argue that, oh, well, actually here you're violating consent, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, yeah, but isn't that what you're doing when you prevent somebody from coming into existence?
So I've spoken about this many times elsewhere, but I mean, the first obvious thing to say is that not all antinatalists are negative utilitarians. But on the red button specifically, like I said, I've gone over this in a range of videos. I'm showing them up on screen now, and you can find them in the description. Get more detail there, but in short, it's not that this is an unpleasant implication of antinatalism. It's that it isn't actually conceptually linked. Or if someone is an antinatalist and their view does imply that they would have to end all of existence, they will have additional views lumped on top of antinatalism that are more specifically tied to that implication. Malcolm then says that one reason some antinatalists give for opting to not press the button is because it would violate consent and autonomy. But he says that antinatalists can't actually use this reason because they are already accepting the violation of consent and autonomy for not bringing someone into existence because they haven't consented to that. Again, I've already gone over that, but Malcolm has this obsession as treating people who don't exist and can never exist like they are people that do exist or will exist regardless of your actions. And it's getting him into all sorts of knots. This way of thinking has all sorts of bizarre implications like the ones I've laid out earlier using the example of bottles of water. I'm sure I'm not going to have convinced Malcolm of changing his view on procreation from the way he currently views it, but I just want to show others who are watching how strange this view is and how it really doesn't seem to capture a reasonable way of viewing procreative ethics. Just one bizarre implication of this view that we harm beings by not bringing them into existence is that there are infinitely more beings that don't exist but could exist than the beings that do actually exist. And so just as a matter of numbers, we should be prioritizing trying to bring as many of them into existence as possible that we can cater for over attending to the needs of people who already exist. And each of us that doesn't have any kids or only has 1 or 2 kids is doing something deeply, gravely immoral by not creating those other people that we could cater for, because you're not letting them choose or denying their autonomy or harming them in a massive way, as Malcolm said earlier.
That said, we don't endorse endlessly spamming the world with babies. We need to carefully weigh the effect a potential life can have on all other potential lives with which it could interact, as well as the potential lives that it may in turn create.
Now, like I've been trying to carefully say before in the video, Malcolm and Simone aren't committed to bringing as many people into existence as possible. They're just committed to bringing as many people into existence as possible who we can cater for, because if you didn't bring them into existence and we could cater for them, you'd be harming them in a deeply immoral way. So everyone who isn't having as many kids as they could cater for, which for some people is probably like 6 or 7 or 8, is doing something deeply immoral.
If you go look in human history, modern antinatalism is one of the only mainstream philosophies today that has absolutely no correlate in distant history. It is a completely modern phenomenon. And she makes a great point. Like, if you are in a culture where it's normal to spend multiple generations building a cathedral, thinking about future generations and their well-being is just going to be natural to the way you perceive reality. Antinatalism is a philosophy somebody would only come to in our current world of instant gratification, of Uber Eats and Amazon.
So Malcolm says that antinatalism doesn't have any remote correlate in history, and he is just completely talking out of his arse here. History is littered with instances of things that basically are antinatalism or are very similar similar to antinatalism. I've got a playlist called The History of Antinatalism, which has videos already in there documenting some of these groups and people, and I'm going to be continuing to add to it. So you can check that out, again, linked in the description below.
To clarify, the irony she is pointing out is antinatalists have built their entire philosophy around saying these signals like suffering and pleasure, specifically suffering, are the only thing that matter in terms of human existence. And yet those very signals are created by the one thing they don't want to do. It's like they built an entire philosophy worshiping the signals the desire to have kids created, while also being antagonistic to the concept of a desire to have kids.
So pleasure and pain aren't necessarily the only things that antinatalists care about. I think Malcolm has made this mistake because it's actually quite a common mistake that people make about antinatalism, because pain and pleasure are exemplars that David Benatar uses in his book Better Never to Have Been, but he explicitly says that they are just exemplars of the wider categories of benefits and harms. There can be other things in those categories apart from pain and pleasure. And yes, the experience of pain and pleasure have arisen through the evolutionary process as a way of motivating us to do things or avoid doing things in order to help us continue to exist and reproduce. But I'm not really sure why Malcolm is raising this. Just because they arose in evolutionary terms as a means of increasing the likelihood of reproduction doesn't mean that we can't value suffering and other harms negatively and say that it's morally wrong to impose on others through procreation. Malcolm then goes on to make a whole argument about why valuing things that we've only come to value because it's been built into us via evolution makes no sense. I.e., we only value suffering negatively because evolution has built it into us that we value suffering negatively, because it's part of our punishment and reward system. Now, of course, it's true that we've come to value things negatively and positively because we're sentient, and sentience arose as a result of our evolutionary history, but I don't see why this means that we have to discount the value that we find in them, both negative and positive value. Everything that we value or even perceive is done through the lens that has been provided to us by evolution. So this wouldn't just be an argument for rejecting the valuing of pain and pleasure, even though antinatalists can value other things as well, but it would be a rejection of valuing anything. So you wouldn't be able to have a conversation about anything. If this is the standard that Malcolm wants to hold antinatalists to, it's going to backfire and disregard anything he values as well, because he has also evolved just like us, and so anything he's valuing is going to be through a lens that he has evolved with. But he also goes on to dismiss the value of intuitions, because again, they're something that have evolved within us. Again, this and the previous point are wider points that can be leveled against basically any ethical system, not just antinatalism. But very quickly, whilst I agree with Malcolm that we shouldn't put all of our considerations into our intuitions, they should play at least some part in our moral decision making. We shouldn't worship at them all the time, but we shouldn't also totally disregard them. In our moral decision making, we need to balance our intuitions and our reason. And I think Malcolm and Simone actually recognize this, because throughout the video and in other places as well, because myself and my friend John had an in-person conversation with them in London a while ago, which again I'll link in the description, but throughout that conversation and this conversation, they have referenced things that sound suspiciously like intuitions, and sometimes even explicitly referenced intuitions as well, in support of their own arguments.
What makes people sad is this concept of baby shoes that are for sale and were never used. We don't know that, like, there was a miscarriage or a baby died. All we know is that there was a baby that could have been, and it's not. And somehow that hits a huge number of people.
Yes.
So that makes me believe that, like, there is sort of a broader intuition that does care about the potentiality there.
There's something very anti-nature about this idea of wanting to extinguish it. Like, the entire purpose of life, of plant life, of animals, of everything is to expand and evolve and grow and reach new territory, right? And that this idea of antinatalism is like, it runs counter to every instinct on a cellular level, on a mental level, on a like every level.
This, like, you can have an abortion until the kid's ready to be born seems obviously horrific to me.
And of course, they talk about the value of agency as well, and how we shouldn't deny non-existent people agency. That's why we should create them. But why should we value agency? This just comes down to their intuition. So they're rejecting intuition as a convenient way to reject moral systems or moral beliefs that they disagree with, but I feel like actually fundamentally they don't reject them, because they seem to heavily rely on them, just like like everyone else. I haven't actually gotten around to reading it yet, but I know there's a book specifically on this topic, which is The Tango of Ethics by Jonathan Layton, and it talks about this balancing of reason with intuitions in our moral decision making. That's if you want to look into this specific topic even more.
The negative externalities of the philosophy are probably the most evil and severe of any philosophy humanity has ever held, significantly more than something like Nazism or communism. If we look at the most evil regimes in history, they often said, well, we want to eradicate X group, like we want to sterilize all the Jews, or we want to sterilize all the Native Americans. Whereas the antinatalists are saying, oh, we want to do that for every group. They are multiplicatively worse for that reason than every one of those regimes, because they want to do this to literally every culture on Earth. Finally, I'd note here that the reason antinatalists are so scary as a philosophy is historically every civilizational conflict we've ever gotten into, like the Cold War over communism versus capitalism, we could at least know, I hope the Russians love their children too. This time we don't have that. It's the first time in human history there has been a significant group that genuinely doesn't love their children and genuinely doesn't care about humanity's future and genuinely wouldn't pull stops if it meant the destruction of all life on Earth.
Malcolm here is again completely misrepresenting antinatalism, and then he's using that misrepresentation to demonize antinatalists. Again, this isn't what antinatalism is. Antinatalism isn't about a campaign to end all of suffering. Some antinatalists might have that as a general view they have, and antinatalism might be part of that, but again, these are two conceptually different things. Antinatalism is not an end-state orientated ideology. What Malcolm is talking about here is much closer to Efilism, which is a view that all sentient life should be ended. And again, for a bazillionth time, I've done a video on that, on why these two things are conceptually different. I've linked it in the description. If you're taken in at all by what Malcolm is saying, then please watch that video and you'll understand why he's just making a complete mistake about tying these two things together. And I'll actually give him some sympathy on this, because there are antinatalists that do this as well. And maybe he's exposed to those antinatalists. But in my view, there are antinatalists that have misconceptions about antinatalism. Again, I've done a video on that. So that was a long one. I didn't even cover everything. There's so much more in their video I didn't get to. It was a frustrating one to watch and to react to. Let me know what you thought of their thoughts. Let me know what you thought of my reaction in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one.